All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. I am happy to be joined today by Byron York, who has a new book, Obsession Inside the Washington Establishment's Never-Ending War on Trump. You can follow him on Twitter at Byron York. Thanks so much for taking the time to join me today, Byron.
Hey, Ben. Thanks very much for having me.
I have been reading your book with interest, and I have to ask you just right off the bat, how could you possibly keep track of all of these different players, figures, dates, moments, etc.? Do you have some room, unlike the one that you're currently in, that looks like the Pepe Sylvia thing from Always Sunny, with all the different threads and pages and everything like that?
No. It's funny. I will say, I wrote the book chronologically. My previous book several years ago was more of a kind of a thematic book, and I wrote parts of it sort of out of order. And this one, I just kind of went straight through. And so I was referring to, I had covered all these things when they happened. And the book really begins with the origins of the James Comey problem, the President Trump's James Comey problem. And so, it really wasn't that hard like we do now. One of the key moments in the book occurs in December 2019. And I was writing it maybe 2 or 3 months later, and it's still hard to believe that it was just 2019. I mean, it was only last year. So a lot of it was actually pretty recent. So I just remembered it.
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of incidents in here that I had completely forgotten. I'm sorry. I mean, it's just the beginning of chapter 2, for instance, you go through this whole thing that happened with the electors, where Joe Biden was sort of frustrated. I mean, you can relay the story. I had completely forgotten that it happened.
This was actually what I was doing. The book is kind of on 2 tracks. There's the Robert Mueller track, and then there's the Congress track. And they always kind of cross over with each other. And because, as you know, under our system, basically a special counsel is kind of like the investigative arm of the House, if the House really wants to impeach a president. But so I'm talking to members, Republican members, and the question is, when do you first get a sense that Democrats are really mad? I mean, madder than usual about Donald Trump's victory, and that they might do, extraordinary things in reaction to it. And they knew that Democrats were quite, stunned on election night, and they were having trouble coping with it during the transition. But on January the 6th, I believe it is, the new Congress receives the results of the Electoral College. The members of the Senate go over to the House, and they go through this kind of ritual, and they go down each state, and each state is found to have electors in good order, and they go to either, in this case, Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. So this always goes kind of routinely. It's by that point it's routine. As a matter of fact, a number of Republicans had said, my first year in Congress was 2009. And I went to the Obama Electoral College thing because it just felt so historic, and I enjoyed seeing it. Well, this wasn't that. A number of Democrats get up and challenge the electoral results in a number of states. And sometimes they say that the Republicans had suppressed the vote, but other times they would say that Donald Trump won the presidency with the aid of Vladimir Putin and Russia, and therefore these electors were illegitimate. And Republicans had gotten a little word a day or two before that maybe something was going to happen during the Electoral College, but they were really stunned at the depth of feeling among some Democrats. So it was kind of the first, chandelier rattling on the Titanic.
You have a little anecdote that at the end of it, Joe Biden having to bang his gavel over and over again to get these folks to stop doing it. He he turns to Paul Ryan and says, "God save the Queen."
What did he mean by that? I still couldn't entirely figure that out. But yeah, Joe Biden was the outgoing vice president. He was the sitting vice president at that point. So he presides over this. And for those who don't remember, Al Gore, who was the sitting vice president in 2000, had to oversee the Electoral College results of the election that he had lost when he actually won the popular vote, but lost the electoral vote. So it can be an awkward situation. And so Joe Biden is presiding over this Electoral College confirmation of Trump's victory. And it has been this wacky scene. And by the way, Biden knew this was going to happen and knocked down each of these members of the House, because they not only had to have the signature of people in the House, they had to have the support of a senator. And there was no senator who signed on to it. So Biden would say, "Sorry, you're out of order," and bang them down. And at the end, it had been kind of a wacky scene. And Paul Ryan, who's the Speaker of the House, starts laughing, and Biden's laughing too. And he says, "God save the Queen," and I don't know what.
It's just, as a vision of what was to come, it works pretty well.
Yeah.
No norm proved too important to throw out in terms of their pursuit.
That's right.
Of the president, and that sort of set the stage for it. Tell me a little bit, as you were going over this and reconstructing this, what were some of the key moments in it that you felt were actually important, as opposed to things that the media pretended were important just to cover them? I'm sure that's a long list, but well,
let me start with just the reason for the whole book, which is in December of 2019, Democrats are rushing to impeach the president by Christmas. And at some point, a reporter says to Nancy Pelosi, "What's the hurry? I mean, why are you rushing here?" And she says, "There's no rush. No rush at all. This has been going on for 2.5 years since the beginning of Mueller." And a lot of Republicans, I don't think any Democrats really noticed it, but a lot of Republicans really noticed that and said, "Wow, she has finally admitted it. This is not about Ukraine. It's not about some phone call. This is a continuation of the long effort to remove President Trump from office." So that kind of frames this whole book. Some of the important moments that didn't get attention were, first of all, the beginning of the Mueller investigation, when Mueller is starting up. The president always believes that if he just talks to people, he can win them over. He can make them like him. This is something he brought with him to Washington from decades in business. Didn't prove fully successful in Washington. So he wants to get off on a good foot with Mueller, and most of all, he wants the investigation over immediately. He wants it over really quickly. So he makes a deal with the Mueller team. You might call it's kind of radical cooperation. He has his lawyers essentially say, "Look, I, President Trump, want this investigation over very quickly. There's no collusion, and I want you to discover that and get this investigation over. Now, you, on the other hand, are going to want a lot of evidence from me. You're going to want lots of documents. You're going to want to interview people at the White House. These things are possibly protected by executive privilege. I could resist. I could fight it in court. We could go on for years and years and years. So here's the deal. I'll give you anything you want, everything you want, as long as you promise to get this thing over quickly." And Mueller says, Robert Mueller himself is at this meeting. Mueller says, "I don't let grass grow under me." Now, everybody takes that to mean yes. And they shake hands on it. And thus begins this period of radical cooperation. And it's really extraordinary what takes place. And Trump just gives hundreds of thousands of documents to Mueller. He lets everybody testify. The White House counsel testified for 30 hours. I mean, just imagine that. Nobody in the previous White House could ever even imagine that happened, but it did. And the deal fell apart by the end of the year, when it became clear that Mueller had not established collusion, hadn't proved what he set out to prove, but he still wasn't closing up. He was actually going to extend the investigation anyway. That's when things all went to hell. And that's the first really big moment. in this.
So I don't want to jump too far ahead, but looking back, do you believe that when Mueller said that he doesn't let grass grow under him,
Yeah.
that he was someone saying that fully confident that he would be in charge of this investigation and that something changed between then and the end? Or was Mueller kind of engaging in some false behavior there? In other words, did he really believe himself when he said that and that it just got out of control, or was it something else going on?
Well, let's start out by saying that's unknowable. But I think he certainly thought that. I think he thought he was in control here. And I think, this story from the book has been coming out just a few hours before we speak, and it's getting a lot of comment. And let's start at the end of the story, which is Mueller testifies on July 24th, 2019. For Democrats, this is going to be a huge moment. It's going to be their Watergate moment. It's Mueller time. He's going to stand up in the House, and he's going to deliver the damning evidence about President Trump, and it's a disaster. He's clearly not up to it. He seems confused. He has difficulty handling even the most basic questions, forming complex sentences. And by the time it's over, a number of people are worried about him, feeling that he has suffered some sort of cognitive decline that they didn't know about. Okay, that's the end of the story. What Trump lawyers discovered during the investigation, they began to suspect something like this was going on. Mueller's team seemed to be covering for him. They didn't let Trump lawyers get Mueller on the telephone. You couldn't get Mueller on the telephone to talk to him, much less meet with him. Trump had basically two legal teams. He had the beginning legal team with John Dowd and Ty Cobb and Jay Sekulow, which lasts from when he's appointed in May 2017 all the way up till about May of 2018. And then Dowd and Cobb leave, and Rudy Giuliani comes. So they have a get acquainted meeting in April of 2018 with Giuliani and some new lawyers, Jane and Marty Raskin, who are distinguished defense lawyers who've joined the team. So it's a get acquainted meeting with Mueller. It's the only meeting they ever have with him. They don't know that, but it is. They don't get him on the phone. And there comes a time in this meeting when they discuss the Justice Department opinion, doctrine, that you cannot indict a sitting president. As you know, that became an incredibly important part of the whole Mueller-Trump thing. And a lot of Democrats and resistance types were hoping Mueller would, I don't know, go slap Trump in handcuffs and indict him and take him down to the station. But this Justice Department policy comes up, and it's very well known. And Mueller doesn't recognize it. He doesn't remember it. He doesn't recall what it is. And the Trump people are kind of looking at each other saying, what's going on? They're genuinely surprised at what's going on. And Mueller prosecutors jump in and say, we're going to be looking at that. We'll get back to you with results. And it was another situation of them trying to cover for Mueller. And afterwards, the Trump people just couldn't figure out what was going on. Just a couple of months before that, Mark Corallo, who briefly worked for the Trump defense team as a communications guy, he was actually interviewed by Mueller, not Mueller, but Mueller's prosecutors. And after the interview, this is in January of 2018, Mueller himself comes in to say hello. They'd known each other. Corallo had worked at the Justice Department. So Mueller comes in, good to see you. Sorry you got pulled into this. Hope you're doing well, that kind of thing. And after he leaves, Corallo's waiting for his car, and he asks the Mueller prosecutors, is Bob okay? Is he getting sleep? Is he eating? He looks tired. And they say, no, he's doing great. He's running rings around us. And we have other accounts of the Mueller prosecutors covering for his condition until it couldn't be covered anymore when there was a hearing in front of the world.
I mean, that just it was such a narrative shift because I can remember, paying so much attention and all the build up to that.
Yeah.
And then people kind of being shocked at this thing that they couldn't expect.
Correct.
And ultimately, I feel like, that just, I assumed at the time was going to take the wind out of the sails of this.
Yeah.
That as much as you could have said, disputes about the way that this started and Comey's involvement and everything related to that, you could say at the end of the day, hey, look, we have this report. It says that there's no collusion. It says so very clearly. And then, you can dispute the different things about obstruction, et cetera, but that was going to take the wind out of sails of impeachment. Politically, why didn't it? Why did impeachment still seem to be the thing that they wanted so badly?
A lot of Republicans thought the same thing. They thought, first of all, during the hearing, they thought this is a disaster. Kevin McCarthy, Devin Nunes were looking and saying, should we keep challenging Mueller? Should we keep doing this? He's obviously struggling to answer this, and we don't want to just beat up on him. And so they thought it was a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought that it would totally end the Russia matter, because the biggest thing, the underlying thing, of course, is that Mueller had issued his report, and it had become public, and he failed to establish that conspiracy or coordination, what we call collusion, took place.
Mm-hmm.
Not only did he not have anybody who did it, he didn't know that he couldn't establish that it even took place. That was a huge blow. I mean, it was just a huge blow to the left and and Maddow world and Democrats and everybody who'd placed such faith in their belief that collusion had occurred. So a lot of Republicans thought, well, it's dead now. But then they wanted Mueller to testify. So they didn't think it was dead. They thought they could revive it with that. But then after Mueller was a disaster, they really think it's dead. Mm-hmm. Instead, what happens is the number of Democrats who say they support impeachment goes up after the Mueller hearing. There had been a vote a week before the Mueller hearing, one of these kind of test votes on impeachment. And remember, the Republicans are still in charge at this point. Excuse me, this is 2019. I'm sorry. There was a vote, and there were 95 votes for impeachment, all Democrats, of course. And a week after the Mueller hearing, the Washington Post did a survey, and there were 114 Democrats who said they supported impeachment. So maybe you thought it was a disaster, maybe Republicans, maybe independents thought it was a disaster, but the Democrats thought it was good and strengthened their case. So what's really interesting is the number of Democrats who support impeaching Trump over Russia, remember this is Russia we're talking about, goes up after Mueller. Jerry Nadler, who's the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, who ends up being edged out in all this, but he wants to impeach over Russia in the Judiciary Committee. And even as they continue to try to do that, Adam Schiff is getting word of a whistleblower. Now, in the meantime, the Trump defense is basically going on vacation. They think that, wow, man, it has been so long. Yep. Finally, this is over. Let's go off for a couple of weeks and lie in the sun. A number of Republicans thought it was over. Finally, the long nightmare is over. But they had something completely different up their sleeve.
So everything shifts to this conversation about Ukraine and the call that is now infamous. And it does so in very weird circumstances. As you said, the Trump legal team feeling like everything's over, Republicans feeling like everything's over.
Yeah.
And sure, Democrats have to say that they're in favor of impeachment, but I mean, they've spent so much time on this. Surely they're going to move off of it at some point. And then this whole call thing happens and plays out. Tell me about the role that some of the different people played in getting this whole thing started, particularly the Vindeman brothers.
Yeah. First of all, Republicans are just completely blindsided by this. As I said, they kind of relaxed after the Mueller report, certainly after the Mueller testimony. They thought it was over. Finally, this long Russia nightmare is over. Then they start hearing murmurs, rumors, something going on. Is there a whistleblower? Who knows? In early September, the House comes back and there's a members-only meeting of the House Intelligence Committee. And Republicans noticed that Adam Schiff, there's something odd about him. And Chris Stewart, one of the members, said he was, I don't want to say giddy, he was so anticipating that we all noticed it. So they thought something was up. They heard it was a whistleblower. Brad Wenstrup said, I kind of blew it off because I had just heard 2.5 years of the Russians are coming and I didn't pay much attention to it. They thought whatever it was, whatever Schiff had up his sleeve was going to be more Russia. They were going to go to the Russia well one more time. And, you know, they were surprised with what actually happened. There's an extended discussion in the book about Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, the active duty Army officer who's the Ukraine guy on the National Security Council in the White House. And basically, Republicans on the Hill came to believe that he was kind of the de facto whistleblower, in the sense that he was not the whistleblower, the person that we refer to, but they thought he played such a huge role and got it started in the sense that of all the people listening to this call, only one thought there was a problem with it, and that was Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. And he was asked at length, both in the secret hearing before the Intelligence Committee and then in the public hearing, well, what did you think was wrong? Did you think there was something illegal? What was it? And all he could say was that he thought that there had just been something wrong about it, and that the president was breaking with what he referred to as the interagency consensus, that is, U.S. policy toward Ukraine, and that it might serve to damage the bipartisan support that Ukraine had on Capitol Hill. So you have X number of people listening to the phone call. You have one who is troubled by it, who thinks there's something wrong. Now, in those hearings, Republicans say, well, who did you tell inside the National Security Council? Okay, I told this person, this person, this person. Fine. Did you tell anybody outside the National Security Council about your concerns about the call? And the answer was yes, 2 people. One of them was George Kent, who was the State Department Ukraine guy. And we saw him testify. He was kind of the bow tie State Department guy. And one other person who was in the intelligence community. Well, who was that? And that's when Adam Schiff breaks in and says, we can't allow you to answer that. You cannot answer that. And Republicans would say, well, why not? Why can't he answer it? We need to know, who he talked to, because this is an important part of how this whole thing got started. Well, you can't answer it because it would tend to identify the whistleblower. Now, Republicans came to believe, and I think it's pretty clear, that Vindman spoke to the whistleblower immediately after the phone call and got this whole thing rolling.
Can you tell me the context of this whole term whistleblower within this moment? Yeah. Because it seemed very odd to me. I remember seeing the very first story published about this, or the existence of a whistleblower. And my assumption was, oh, there's someone who's found some agency doing something wrong, or spending money in a way that they shouldn't. I think of the whistleblower statute as being designed to protect those types of people in those type of tier of jobs. I don't think about it in any concept as being designed to protect someone who disagreed with a policy decision being made by the president. Well, why did it shake out in this terminology and the way it was used?
This was crazy. In fact, the Whistleblower Protection Act, the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act, specifically says it is not for policy differences. You can't go report your superior because you disagree with the policy. Your view of what a whistleblower is entirely consistent with the rest of the U.S. government's view. It's for, if you're in the Department of the Interior and your boss is misusing the credit card, you want to report it and not suffer repercussions at work, that's a whistleblower kind of thing. There were 2 issues involved. you can't be a whistleblower against the President of the United States. There is no White House Inspector General. It doesn't work that way. And the other thing is, specifically in the intelligence community, if you look at the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act, it has to be a person in the intelligence community who has a concern about some sort of wrongdoing in the intelligence community under the purview of the Director of National Intelligence. Now, there's no way in the world that the President of the United States is under the purview of the Director of National Intelligence. No way in the world. So, in every way, this does not fit the whistleblower, either the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act or the broader federal definition and understanding of a whistleblower. Mm-hmm. So how did it get done? Democrats controlled one house of Congress. They could force people to come testify. Mm-hmm. And the acting director of intelligence came up and said, I'm not handing this over because it's not covered by the Whistleblower Protection Act, which is absolutely true. And then the Justice Department agreed with that, said it doesn't fall under the purview of the Whistleblower Protection Act. But then the Inspector General of the intelligence community said, I want to give this to you in Congress. And, you make enough noise, and Adam Schiff got it. Mm-hmm. And then it just didn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
But, and it's almost a forgotten issue in here, but it was an absolutely crazy twisting of whistleblower laws.
I would not be surprised if this type of issue comes back to bite us in the future. It really sets
with a C.
Yeah, exactly. So I am curious about your perspective on one aspect of this, and that's the shift from Jerry Nadler being the tip of the spear on this to Adam Schiff. Yeah. How did that play out over the course of this impeachment run, both under Russia and under Ukraine? And what did it tell us about the internal dynamics of Democratic leadership on this question?
Well, this was a bit of a problem for Nancy Pelosi. Remember that great article that Molly Hemingway wrote in the transition right after the election of 2018. She's riding the Acela between Washington D.C. and New York, and she's in one of those in the cafe car where there's tables, and Nadler is over in the seat by the window, and she's on the other side in the seat by the aisle, just right across from him, and he's on the phone talking loudly about impeachment. And she said, I interviewed her for the book. I wanted to know more about it. She had her laptop out, and she was just listening to him, and she was actually taking notes right in front of him. He thought she was writing a letter or something. I don't know. But you tell from that conversation that, one, impeachment was very much alive. Democrats had not talked about it in the campaign. It wasn't part of their campaign, but they were planning for it if they won. And two, there was going to be a division of labor between Schiff and the intelligence community, which had been doing obviously a lot of the Russia investigating anyway, and Nadler's Judiciary Committee. But what happened is Nadler is riding the weakening, dying horse, which is Russia, and Schiff is riding the strong horse, which is Ukraine. It's new. It's hot. We don't know about it. We haven't already failed in our investigation of it. Plus, Nadler is just not terribly was not up to the job. Mm-hmm. And there was a hearing. He couldn't get witnesses to come testify before him. There was a hearing where he actually had John Dean from Watergate come up and testify. And Dean basically starts off by saying, the last time I was before this committee was 47 years ago. And he had nothing, beyond his CNN or MSNBC commentary to offer. And then the real nail in the coffin was when Nadler had Corey Lewandowski come to testify. And Lewandowski just ran rings around Nadler. He mocked him. He didn't answer questions. He delayed. It was just a fiasco. And Democrats saw that and said, look, we cannot do this impeachment in the Judiciary Committee with this chairman.
Yeah.
I think Pelosi ultimately agreed with that, and Schiff became the leader of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. There is additionally to that incident that you recount with Hope Hicks testifying before the committee, where they referred to her repeatedly as Ms. Lewandowski,
Yes.
in what I believe to be an intentional slight. But Nadler said he had some excuse. I was distracted or something, he said.
It was interesting. That episode is also in the book, but it was kind of either I wasn't doing it intentionally or I'm just too distracted to do my job here. So it didn't look good from that.
Either way, it didn't look good. Once this becomes a Schiff show, what changes about the approach that they're using? Because to me, Nadler seemed almost silly and very aggressive, and Schiff seemed far more technical in the way that he was doing it, but also in a way that made very little sense to the viewer who wasn't up on their resistance fan fiction. Like when you're talking about the inconsistent with the interagency consensus.
Yeah.
That's a completely different thing than saying, Trump colluded with Russia to win the election. It's a much different kind of set of variables.
Absolutely. Well, Schiff runs a much more tighter and more systematic ship. There's no doubt about it. He starts off holding hearings. The first one he has is with Michael Atkinson, the Inspector General of the intelligence community. That's just for the Intelligence Committee. And the transcript of that has never been released. Never. Still secret to this day. Then he begins hearings with three committees. So there are members of his own Intelligence Committee, there's members of the Oversight Committee, and of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So they're all questioning witnesses. And they have Volker, a U.S. envoy to Ukraine, as their first witness. And it's what's called a transcribed interview. Now, there's not a lot of security around a transcribed interview. That is, Volker can come in and speak and answer questions, and then afterwards, members can go out and tell the press what was said. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what Republicans did, because Volker's testimony tended to support President Trump. It did not support the idea of a quid pro quo. It supported the idea that Ukrainians were actually pretty happy with their situation, with their relationship with the United States. And Schiff actually tries to just harangue him in the questioning to agree with him, and he just won't do it. So it's not a good start for Schiff. And the biggest problem is the public gets to find out, because Republicans can come out and talk about it. So what they did was he changed the format of these things to formal depositions. And just because of House rules, this is arcane stuff, but because of House rules, depositions are secret. Mm-hmm. And members cannot recount for the public what is said in a deposition. And if they do, they could face ethics charges. Now, remember that Democrats had sidelined Devin Nunes on ethics charges in 2017, so Republicans knew how that worked. Mm-hmm. And they abided by these rules. What emerged, though, was a system in which the witnesses would load all of their damaging testimony into an opening statement. And then somehow it would get to the press. It would be reported even as the deposition was going on. It would all look really bad for Trump, and Republicans couldn't come out and say, but wait a minute, when we asked him about this, he said that.
Yeah.
And so it really, really worked. It was a system that worked very well for Democrats and Schiff, and caused enormous resentment among Republicans.
Well, I mean, understandably, if you feel like there's other evidence that isn't getting out there and it's only tilted on one side, you could see why that is. As this played out, I'm curious about your perspective of the way the politics shifted. Uh, Nancy Pelosi seemed to be, one of the big things when she got the gavel back was she's going to tamp down on all these hard left people who want to do crazy things like impeach the president.
Yeah.
She's going to keep that in its box. She's going to run the kind of investigations that produce damaging information about administrations, and she's going to keep them from making what could be a political mistake. She was obviously pushed to the point where she had to not just, accept it, but embrace it. What do you think was happening politically there within her own conference, that a lot of these people just convinced themselves that this was such a good idea, because it seemed to be a combination of donor pressure and a lot of other things pressing people to ignore what the smartest or lauded as the smartest political actors in the room were saying that they ought to do?
Well, I think that certainly through the 2018 election, she had been opposed to talking about impeachment. I mean, there's two things. You can be opposed to publicly talking about it and then opposed to privately planning for it. And I think she allowed them to privately plan for it. And I think that she felt that after the Mueller report, the Democrats' chances of impeachment were greatly diminished. But remember, I told you about the growing number of Democrats who voted for impeachment. The first such vote was in December 2017. Representative Al Green, who's kind of a recurring character in the book, he pops up every couple of chapters. He was the most aggressive and earliest advocate of impeachment. Actually calls for Trump's impeachment on the floor of the House May 17th, 2017, the day that Mueller is appointed. Mm-hmm. And in December, he gets a vote. Paul Ryan decides to just give him a vote because he's going to use point of personal privilege and order and all of these procedures to get a vote. And 66 Democrats vote in favor of impeachment. So what happens is he gets succeeding votes over the next year, and the number keeps going up. And just before the Mueller testimony, there's 95 Democrats. And then I told you that it went up to 114. Well, once they got Ukraine going, then if this number started at 114, I mean, it was well over half of her conference. And at that point, she really didn't have control. And when a group of so-called moderates, women who'd been elected in 2018, not on impeachment, some of whom had national security experience in their resumes, when they come out for impeachment, I mean, she basically has to go along. Mm-hmm. And I mean, she does it with such rigor that, remember, Trump releases the transcript of the Zelensky phone call on September 25th. She announces impeachment the day before. She doesn't wait. She on September 24, she announces impeachment. So she's really all on board by the time that happens.
It's the line from Yes Minister. I am their leader. I must follow them. We could talk about all types of manners of details in this book. I'm curious what one of the more amusing or interesting elements of it was that you found yourself as you were going over your notes and reporting.
Well, one of the things I looked at was in the Mueller investigation, right after it started, you could see by the interviews that Mueller immediately started looking for impeachment. Looking for collusion everywhere. Yeah. He interviews people around the Papadopoulos matter, around Carter Page. He goes into, remember that episode at the Republican convention in 2016 in which Josh Rogan in the Washington Post wrote that Republicans had gutted the platform, Trump had gutted the platform on Ukraine to please Putin? Mm-hmm. It's just crazy. But the Trump people can see him doing all these interviews and looking for impeachment, for collusion, and not finding it. So the search for collusion goes on and on. And by the time they have a big meeting in December of 2017, it's clear that he hasn't found collusion, and the Trump people want him to just close up shop, which he won't do. In the months after that, Mueller has moved fully to searching for obstruction of justice. As a matter of fact, the year after December of 2017 is just one long fight over the president's testimony about obstruction of justice. Collusion is really just over. It is a sideline, a footnote. But every now and then on CNN and MSNBC, you would have these stories that pop up, and they would all convince themselves that collusion was about to be confirmed. This is it. Mm-hmm. And you just had this breathless reporting. And looking back on it, you can see that it was just dead. I mean, it was absolutely dead at that point. And yet they were all getting themselves just agitated over it, over and over and over again. And it would be, it'd be funny if it wasn't, the consequences weren't so terrible for the United States and for the president. But it was, they were almost comic actors in this when you look at what was actually going on behind the scenes.
So that sets me up perfectly for one last question, which is just, as someone who was one of the handful of people who got this story right as it was going along with, maybe even single digits of other prominent reporters in Washington, one, how uncomfortable was that during the process of it? And two, why is it that the media, I know that they don't like to look within themselves, but why are they getting away from this story having any consequences for the way that they report something like this out in the future?
Well, one, it wasn't really that uncomfortable. I had, obviously, a lot of my sources were Republicans who were asking questions about this, some of whom were in a position to actually demand information when Republicans were in the majority in the House. So it wasn't that uncomfortable, but I just thought, especially when we began learning about the dossier, and we're talking about January of 2017, so before Trump is actually president. Mm-hmm. I just thought this was really weird, and I have to say, just as a matter of citizenship, I think it's a bad idea to have a presidential election in which both the major candidates are under the investigation of the FBI. Mm-hmm. I think either they're too squirrely candidates or the FBI is in places it shouldn't be, and I think it's the latter in this case. Yeah. So I thought that was very bad. So I wasn't that uncomfortable about it. As far as members of the press being rewarded for their erroneous reporting, for their reporting that set off frenzies about what was later shown to be nothing, well, what can I say? That's just the way things go. People got prizes for this, Pulitzers and Peabodys and other prizes for this, and so much of it was just dead wrong. What's interesting now is I guess you've noticed this. There are some Russia dead enders trying to make a comeback. Yep. We've seen Michael Schmidt's book, which basically starts with the premise that Trump was totally guilty and why did Mueller fail to bring him down. And you've seen Jeffrey Toobin's book, which starts with the premise that Trump was guilty and why did Mueller fail to bring him down. And you're seeing, Peter Strzok's book is out. Andrew Weitzman, Mueller's Pitbull, has a book coming out. So I think you're getting a lot of people who are still defending their position, even though Robert Mueller, who had a team of very aggressive prosecutors, who had all the time they needed, all the money they needed, all the resources they needed, and most importantly, all of the law enforcement powers you can have in the United States, and they couldn't establish that this happened. Mm-hmm. But instead of just moving on and saying we were wrong, they're going to continue to insist, perhaps to their dying day, that it really took place.
The book is Obsession. You can find it online and wherever books are sold. Byron York, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and walk us through all of the twists and turns of this.
Thank you, Ben. I enjoyed it.
I'm Ben Domenech. You're listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.